Skeptics make lots of arguments against the Bible, but there's one that stands out as the worst argument because it would destroy our understanding of history if it were taken seriously. And that is the copies of copies argument against the Bible. Skeptics, usually atheists, but sometimes Muslims who are parroting atheist arguments, will say that we can't know what the Bible originally said because we don't have the original copies of the biblical texts, and so they could have been radically changed at some point in the copying process. Even critics who should know better peddle this kind of doubt about Scripture, like in this interview with New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman on a pro-Islam channel.
We don't have Matthew's gospel. We don't have the original thing he wrote. What we have are copies that were made of that original thing he wrote. And as it turns out, we don't actually have the first copies. We don't have copies of the copies, and we don't have copies of the copies of the copies. We have copies that are from, so the first time we get a complete copy of the Gospel of Matthew, like from beginning to end with a manuscript, the whole thing is 300 years later.
Ehrman is correct that we no longer possess the original manuscripts of the Bible. But here's why this is a bad argument. We don't have the original manuscripts of any work that was composed in the ancient world. We don't have Plato's original Republic. We don't have the original Jewish histories of Josephus. We don't have the original Roman histories of Tacitus or the Greek histories of Thucydides.
And those are not brought into question at all.
Those books are written on dried leaves or animal skins that were lost, destroyed, or decayed over time. But modern scholars can reconstruct the original manuscripts of these works to an extremely high degree of accuracy by comparing all the surviving copies through a process called textual criticism. For example, although we do not have any of Plato's original writings, we do have about 250 ancient manuscripts that help us reconstruct what Plato originally said. For many other ancient writers, we have only a handful of manuscripts, and sometimes only a single copy of the original that itself was written centuries or even millennia later. But this does not deter scholars from knowing what these ancient texts originally said. So the argument for the Bible's reliability, at least when it comes to the New Testament, would go something like this. 1. Based on manuscript evidence, we are confident that our copies of ancient non-biblical literature accurately reflect what those authors originally wrote. 2. There is greater manuscript evidence for the Bible than for ancient non-biblical literature. 3. Therefore, we should be just as, if not more confident, that our copies of the Bible accurately reflect what the biblical authors originally wrote. In this episode, I'm going to focus on the manuscripts for the New Testament. If you'd like to see some debate about the textual reliability of the Old Testament, check out Gavin Ortland's recent interaction with Cosmic Skeptic on the reliability until I bring up the Bible. When that happens, some of them bite the bullet and they say, yeah, you're right. We have no idea what any of these ancient authors really wrote in the first place. And that's why I said this is the worst argument. It forces people who want to debunk the Bible to throw out most of history in order to be consistent with their overly skeptical attitudes. It's why I said in my debate with Matt Dillahunty that his argument about claims not being evidence would destroy most of our knowledge of history, since nearly all ancient historical evidence are just claims somebody made about what happened. In response, some critics say the Bible needs to be held to a different, higher standard because what it says about salvation and hell and morality is more important than what Plato or Josephus says about the ancient world. But this argument isn't convincing. Consider the medicines in your medicine cabinet. You trust those medicines are what they say they are based on the label's description.
Correct.
So if you have a slight itch, you trust the anti-itching cream is really what the label says it is.
Yeah, you're not really going to go behind the counter and try to make it yourself or try to identify that whatever is in the ingredients on the label, whatever ingredients are on the label that are actually inside of your medication. No one does that because at some type of point in time, you have to have faith in something, right? I have faith that when I go to my local pharmacy, I'm going to pick up the prescriptions that I was prescribed. It is what it is. I have faith that whenever I order this coffee, it's going to taste a certain type of way that I'm used to. I'm not going to go behind the counter and make it myself. So that I can see why he would say that, and that is a very flawed argument.
But suppose you're dying from an allergic reaction and you need one particular kind of medicine to save you. You don't say, well, this medicine is much more important to my life than anti-itching cream. Therefore, I need more evidence to know it's the right medicine than just what the label says, so I'm not going to take it. No, You just take the medicine because it passes the test all the other medicines pass. You might read the label more than once to make sure you aren't mistaken, but you don't need to call the factory for more evidence that it was labeled correctly. Likewise, the potential impact of the Bible on our lives does not justify imposing an arbitrary evidence standard for the Bible that we don't impose on any other ancient work. The other objection skeptics make in this context is the Spider-Man argument. They say, well, there are millions of manuscripts about Spider-Man saving people in New York, but that doesn't mean these events really happened. The Christian channel Testify has a good video debunking the Spider-Man disproves Jesus argument, so I'll link to it below. My simple response would be that I am not trying to prove the Bible is true via the number of manuscript copies of the Bible. That's just one part of my whole case. I'm just answering the skeptic's claim that our current copies of the Bible do not accurately reflect what the original authors wrote. I'm refuting that claim. The truth of what the original authors wrote is a separate issue that I'm happy to address. But before we can do that, we first have to agree on what the original biblical authors wrote, and then we can debate the truthfulness of what they wrote about. But what makes the New Testament unique, different from all other ancient works, is both the sheer number of copies we have of it and the reverence people paid to those copies. There currently exist over 5,500 copies of New Testament manuscripts written in Greek, as well as 15,000 manuscripts written in other languages, like Latin, Coptic, and Syriac. 50 of the Greek manuscripts can be dated to within 250 years of the original copies. The first complete copy of the New Testament, called Codex Sinaiticus, because it was discovered in a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, can be dated to within 300 years of the original documents. Now you might say, wait, how is that impressive? I said there were 50 New Testament manuscripts in the first 2 centuries, but that there were 250 manuscripts of Plato's dialogues. So why is the New Testament more impressive? Well, that's true, but when you consider Plato's dialogues, only 2 fragments of these 250 manuscripts come from the first 400 years after Plato wrote his dialogue. The oldest complete surviving copy of Plato's dialogues comes from 1,200 years later, completely different than the 300 years later of the full and complete New Testament that we have. Or compare this to Homer's Iliad, which was written in the 8th century before Christ. Although a few fragments of the Iliad can be dated to within 500 years of Homer, the oldest complete copy of the Iliad, a manuscript scholars refer to as Venetus A, was written in the 10th century AD, 1,800 years later. The biblical scholar F.F. Bruce put it bluntly: there is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. The reason we have so many copies of the New Testament is that as new church communities sprang up in Europe and Asia, these communities wanted a copy of the scriptures for their public liturgies and for private reading. During this time, Christianity was illegal within the Roman Empire, so Christians who copied the New Testament, scribes, endured monotonous hours of writing by hand and risked painful deaths just so others could have a copy of Scripture. Although some of these copies have been lost, many others survive, due in large part to the idea that scribal copying was a way to glorify God. The products of this divine service were then revered and protected for centuries. In the 6th century, the monk Cassiodorus, who was a contemporary of St. Benedict, said the following: "What happy application, what praiseworthy industry, to preach unto men by means of the hand, to untie the tongue by means of the fingers, to bring quiet salvation to mortals, and to fight the devil's insidious wiles with pen and ink." So much for the anti-Catholic myth that says the church wanted to keep the Bible from people. Now, these supporters of the Bible were almost as supportive as the subscribers of the Council of Trent, who always like my videos and leave a comment to help the video be better recommended. And the ones who really like our work support us at TrenthornPodcast.com, where they get access to bonus content and allow Jesus, where Ehrman says there are more differences among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Scholars believe that there are about 200,000 to 400,000 differences among all the New Testament manuscripts.
And just to kind of circle back on that, it's you're gonna have differences, especially when you have different variations of any book. What you have to really ask yourself is the following: if I'm reading a passage or let's just say I'm reading an entire page. I read it in the NIV, and then I read it in the King James, or you choose which Bible you want to read it from. But you have two different variations. Did the overall message change? Let's say there's a difference in two sentences, or two or three sentences. Did their overall message change? Because if the answer is no, that's what you have to take away from it. Instead of going word by word by word, you should be asking yourself, does the message overall remain the same? And if the answer is yes, doesn't matter how many variations you want to put out there, Jesus is still king. Catch you on the next one.